The Battle of Waterloo, one of the most pivotal moments in history. It wasn't just a fight between two armies. It was the clash of empires, the end of an era, and the shaping of the modern world. What led to this dramatic confrontation, and why did it change everything? Join us as we step into the heart of this legendary battle and explore how the fate of nations hung in the balance. What would have happened if Napoleon had won? The world may have been an entirely different place. Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the most iconic figures in world history, was born on August 15, 1769, in Corsica, a French island in the Mediterranean. His rise from a minor noble family to the Emperor of France is nothing short of extraordinary. In the late 18th century, Europe was in chaos. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, was shaking the foundations of the old monarchies across Europe. Amidst this turbulence, Napoleon emerged as a brilliant military strategist and leader. His journey from an artillery officer to Emperor of France is a testament to his ambition, intelligence, and determination. Napoleon's early military career was shaped by the French Revolution, which provided him the opportunity to rise through the ranks. As a young officer, Napoleon quickly gained a reputation for his ability to win battles. His first major success came in Italy in 1796, where he led the French army to a series of victories against the Austrians. This campaign made him a national hero in France. His military genius was becoming widely recognized, and soon he was tasked with leading the French forces in Egypt. While his Egyptian campaign was not as successful, it helped solidify his fame. And upon his return to France in 1799, he was hailed as a hero. Napoleon's political maneuvering was just as sharp as his military skills. In 1799, he seized power in a coup, overthrowing the French government and establishing himself as first consul. Within a few years, he would crown himself Emperor of the French in 1804, solidifying his control over the nation. Napoleon's reign brought about significant reforms in France, including the Napoleonic Code, which became the basis for modern legal systems in many countries. But his ambitions were far greater than just ruling France. He sought to dominate Europe and establish a French empire that would last for centuries. Napoleon's expansionist dreams led him to wage war across the continent. By 1807, he had conquered much of Europe, from Spain to Russia. His Grand Army, the largest military force ever assembled in Europe, was feared by every nation. However, despite his overwhelming successes, Napoleon's empire was far from stable. His constant wars strained France's resources, and as he expanded his influence, he made powerful enemies. The British, led by Wellington, and the Russian Tsar, Alexander I, were among his most determined adversaries. But it wasn't just military might that made Napoleon a feared leader. His charisma, political acumen, and ability to inspire his soldiers were unmatched. His soldiers adored him, and his presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of any fight. However, as his empire grew, so did the resistance. Napoleon's overextension in Russia in 1812 was a major turning point. The disastrous invasion led to the destruction of much of his Grand Army and marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. By 1814, the once great Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. Yet, Napoleon's story didn't end there. He would return to France in 1815, beginning what would become his final campaign, the Battle of Waterloo. But how did he go from the heights of power to exile, and what happened in the months leading up to Waterloo? After his abdication and exile to the island of Elba in 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte was not content to live a life of quiet reflection. Even though his empire had crumbled, his ambition was undeterred. Napoleon's return to power began on March 1, 1815. When he escaped from Elba and sailed back to France, determined to reclaim his throne, his return marked the beginning of the 100 Days, a period that would set the stage for his final confrontation at the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's comeback was swift and dramatic. He landed on the French mainland with a small group of followers, but his charisma and leadership were enough to rally former supporters. As he marched towards Paris, his army grew rapidly as disillusioned soldiers and officers who had once served under him flocked to his cause. King Louis XVIII, the Bourbon monarch who had been restored to the throne after Napoleon's exile, was caught off guard. Despite the loyalty of the French army, the king's forces hesitated, and many of them ultimately defected to Napoleon's side. Napoleon's return to power caused panic among the European powers who had previously defeated him. The Congress of Vienna, which had been convened to redraw the map of Europe after Napoleon's fall, had worked to restore the old monarchies and prevent any further French expansion. The news of Napoleon's return sent shockwaves through the continent. The major European powers, Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, quickly formed an alliance to stop him. The fear was that Napoleon would once again attempt to conquer Europe, just as he had done before. In response, the European powers began mobilizing their forces, and Napoleon knew that he had little time to act. His strategy was to strike quickly, as he had in the past, before his enemies could consolidate their forces. Napoleon's first military action upon returning to power was to face the armies of the Seventh Coalition, which consisted of British and Dutch forces under the command of the Duke of Wellington, as well as Prussian troops led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Napoleon's strategy was to divide and conquer, hoping to defeat the British and Prussian armies separately before they could unite. His plan was risky, as the forces he was facing were large and well-coordinated. However, Napoleon's confidence in his military abilities, combined with the loyalty of his troops, made him believe that victory was within reach. The battle that would ultimately decide his fate was the Battle of Waterloo. The stakes were enormous, not just for Napoleon, but for the future of Europe. The outcome of this battle would determine whether Napoleon could once again seize control of France and re-establish his empire, or whether his reign would finally come to a definitive end. As both sides prepared for the inevitable confrontation, tensions in Europe reached their peak. Would Napoleon's genius on the battlefield be enough to overcome the combined might of the Allied forces, or had his time finally run out? The answer would soon be decided in a place that would become forever linked to his legacy, Waterloo. On the morning of June 18, 1815, the fate of Europe hung in the balance. The Battle of Waterloo, fought near the small Belgian town of Waterloo, was about to unfold, and it would forever change the course of history. Napoleon Bonaparte, the former Emperor of France, was facing the combined forces of the Seventh Coalition and Alliance of Britain, the Netherlands, Prussia, and other European nations. Leading the British forces was the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, while the Prussian army was commanded by Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Both commanders were determined to end Napoleon's reign for good. Napoleon's strategy for the battle was ambitious but risky. His primary goal was to divide and defeat the Allied armies before they could unite. He believed that by first dealing with the British forces, he could then turn his attention to the Prussians. Napoleon had a strong belief in his military genius, having won numerous battles across Europe, and he hoped that the weather and the terrain would play to his advantage. The battle took place on a muddy, rain-soaked field, which made the conditions challenging for both sides. Napoleon's forces, numbering around 73,000 men, were faced with Wellington's army of about 68,000 British, Dutch, and Belgian troops. Prussians, who were positioned a few miles away, had around 50,000 soldiers. The battle began at 11:30 a.m., with Napoleon launching a series of attacks on the Allied positions. The first major assault was against the center of Wellington's line, where the French launched a massive infantry assault. The British soldiers, well-trained and resolute, held their ground and repelled the French forces. Napoleon, however, had carefully prepared his strategy, hoping to wear down the enemy and exploit any weaknesses. His forces had an advantage in artillery, and they used this to bombard the Allied positions, trying to soften them up for an eventual breakthrough. One of the key moments of the battle came with the arrival of the Prussian army. Blücher's troops, having been delayed by Napoleon's forces earlier in the day, finally arrived on the battlefield around 4 p.m. This reinforcements provided a critical boost to the Allied forces, tipping the scales in their favor. The French, already stretched thin and struggling to maintain control of the battlefield, were now faced with the combined might of two powerful armies. Napoleon had hoped to defeat the British and hold off the Prussians, but the arrival of Blücher's forces spelled the end of his hopes for victory. As the battle raged on, the French were forced into a retreat. Napoleon's right wing, which had been the focus of his initial attacks, began to crumble. The British held firm, and the Prussians launched a fierce assault on the French flank. The French army, demoralized and overwhelmed, was soon in full retreat. By the evening, Napoleon's once mighty Grand Army was in disarray, and the battle was effectively lost. The cost of the Battle of Waterloo was enormous. The French suffered heavy casualties, with around 25,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The British and their allies also lost around 22,000 men. But the true cost was not in the numbers alone. It was the end of an era. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo marked the conclusion of his reign, and with it, the end of his dreams of rebuilding his empire. The impact of Waterloo was immediate and far-reaching. Napoleon was forced to abdicate once again and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would live out the remainder of his life. The defeat also solidified the power of the European monarchies. The Congress of Vienna had already been working to restore the balance of power in Europe. The battle was not just a military defeat for Napoleon, it was the end of an entire era of revolutionary change and war. Waterloo was not just a battle, it was the decisive turning point that reshaped the future of Europe and the world. With Napoleon's defeat, the long period of Napoleonic Wars came to a close, and Europe entered a new phase of relative peace, known as the Concert of Europe. However, the scars of the conflict would remain, and the events that followed would continue to echo throughout history. The Battle of Waterloo was, indeed, a turning point, a moment where the tides of history changed forever. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, was not just the end of one battle, it marked the end of an entire era. Napoleon Bonaparte's defeat brought a dramatic shift to the political landscape of Europe, signaling the collapse of his empire and the restoration of monarchies that had been overthrown in the wake of the French Revolution. The aftermath of Waterloo was as significant as the battle itself, setting the stage for a new European order and the final exile of Napoleon. Following his defeat, Napoleon was forced to retreat and abdicate for the second time. His dreams of restoring the French Empire crumbled, and the military genius who had once dominated Europe was now a fugitive. The once feared emperor, who had shaped the destinies of nations, now faced the consequences of his failure. He fled to Paris, but the French people, exhausted by years of war, had turned against him. The Bourbon monarchy, represented by King Louis XVIII, was restored to the throne of France, marking the end of Napoleon's reign. Napoleon, now a prisoner of war, was placed under the custody of the British, who were determined to ensure he would never rise to power again. Rather than being imprisoned in Europe, where he might inspire further rebellions, the British exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. Located far from the European mainland, St. Helena was a place of isolation and exile, chosen to prevent any possibility of escape or return. Napoleon arrived on St. Helena in October 1815, where he would spend the final years of his life in relative obscurity. St. Helena, Napoleon's life took a dramatic turn. Stripped of his former glory, he lived in a small residence on the island, surrounded by a handful of loyal followers. Despite his isolation, Napoleon never lost his sense of ambition. He spent his time reflecting on his past, dictating memoirs to his companions, and continuing to write letters to political leaders, though his messages were largely ignored. His health, already weakened by years of warfare and stress, began to decline. The harsh conditions on St. Helena, combined with his advancing age, took a toll on his body, and in May 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. Napoleon's death did not erase the impact he had left on the world. His legacy, both as a military genius and a controversial leader, continued to resonate long after his passing. His reign had brought significant changes to France and Europe. The Napoleonic Code, a set of legal reforms he introduced, continued to influence the development of legal systems in many countries. His military tactics were studied by future generals and became a cornerstone of military education worldwide. Napoleon's ideas about governance and his emphasis on meritocracy also left a lasting imprint on European society. The political fallout from Waterloo also reshaped Europe's power dynamics. The Congress of Vienna, which had been convened to reorganize Europe after Napoleon's initial defeat, continued its work after Waterloo. The Congress sought to restore the balance of power in Europe and prevent any single nation from becoming too powerful again. The Bourbon monarchy in France was restored, and many of the other monarchies that had been toppled by Napoleon were re-established. However, the Congress of Vienna also set the stage for future conflicts. As the political and social upheaval of the Napoleonic era had sparked movements for reform and revolution across Europe, Waterloo was not just the end of Napoleon. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in European history. The long period of warfare that had defined much of the early 19th century came to an end, and a new era of relative peace was ushered in. The Concert of Europe, a system of international cooperation and diplomacy, was established to manage European relations and prevent further wars. But the peace that followed Waterloo was fragile. The seeds of future conflicts, including the two world wars of the 20th century, were already being sown. Napoleon's fall at Waterloo did not extinguish his legacy. In many ways, it solidified his place in history as one of the most significant figures in world history. His life and his defeat at Waterloo serve as a reminder of the fragility of power, the fleeting nature of empires, and the unrelenting march of history